Good afternoon. This is Daryl Gabe, Aaron Fox. I welcome everybody to this program. This is the first in a series of three programs discussing how to go forward, view the time period of midst of COVID-19. Today's program is going to discuss the concept of what you should be considering and doing relative to planning and legal considerations as it applies to going forward with respect to an on-site operation. And tomorrow's program actually done tomorrow's program. Thursday's program is going to discuss doing remote work. And then next Tuesday, we're going to have a program that's going to focus on some of the traditional labor issues relative to issues going to COVID-19. I am pleased to announce the members of my panel. In addition to myself, there's John Hamlin of Marsh McLennan, Lisa Damon of Safe Offshore, Pamela Jeffrey of Levy Ratner, Melissa Washington of Outten and Golden. For those who don't know the firms well, I am a management lawyer. John Hamlin is obviously in-house counsel. SafeOff is also an outside counsel who represents management. Pamela Jeffrey is an attorney that represents unions, and Melissa Washington is an attorney that represents plaintiffs. So we're going to have a very diverse discussion today about the possible issues and how should be looked at from different sides. As I pointed out, the whole purpose of this presentation is to kind of look at and identify the logistical considerations that should be taken in mind when you're thinking about planning the process of going forward. Some of you guys have already been in operation, so it's mending those things, discussing those things, as well as the legal considerations in mind. I want to make sure people understand that we're not intending today to give legal advice. Each institution, as we all know, in fact-based cases of labor employment law, are so fact-based and unique, and you should consult with your individual counsel before doing anything if you are actually in-house counsel. Now, looking at the different things that we might consider today, there are a lot of different stages you might be in your operation. You could be a institution that has been working on-site fully up to date. You could be an institution that's only been partially working on-site with some employees working remotely. You could be a facility that's working with some employees remote and others furloughed. You could be a place with on-site with balanced furloughs. You could be totally remote. You could be a place with remotely with some employees furloughed. I have seen all variations of that with my client base. Each of those are nevertheless necessary to understand when you're going forward and planning out how to go. You gotta, when you're approaching this issue, look at your business performance and consider the current exposure. How you've been performing, what are the things you've been exposed to. In doing that, you need to think, how did my business operate pre-February, March 2020? What are the things that worked for us, what things didn't work for us? And you gotta look forward, what's my business gonna look like going forward? And again, I've told my clients, don't compare your plan based upon the concept of, okay, I think there's another 3 months or 6 months of COVID-19 that we're gonna have to deal with. So let's figure out how we operate from perspective of the next 3 to 6 months. I don't think it's possible at this point to predict how long we're going to be in this quagmire. And given that, I think we should be looking at the lessons learned over the last 6 months, figuring out very carefully what worked, what didn't work, and what was things that were productive, what wasn't productive. Was working remotely good for some people, working remotely not good for some people, did some parts of the practice not work well, and we need to evaluate the operation based upon that. We need to very much consider how does my business change? You know, there are those who say resuming operations. We've moved away from that word to going forward because in a lot of ways, I don't think people think we're going to go back to the way it was pre-COVID-19. We're going to go forward, yes, but not to the same thing it was before. And with that in mind, we should be looking at how we run our operations, our businesses, even our law firms in this new environment. All of us have now learned through the seminars earlier that the idea of remote working is not implausible, not impossible. In fact, where it used to be something very realistic for professionals, now we're seeing people who are non-professionals and who are non-exempt employees working remotely. It is very doable, but it has certain ramifications and considerations. Among those things, as you're planning this, you need to think before you put in place a plan, what am I starting with? So you need to look at your legal exposure. You need to evaluate during this time period up to date. Have I put my operation in some exposure for wage and hour violation? Have I deviated from existing policies during COVID-19? How am I going to explain that? How am I going to rationalize that? Does that mean I'm locked into this new position? Does it mean I need to change my policies? What impacts has it had on my employees? Has that created any legal ramifications where I might get a lawsuit because of that? You need to look at your employees' job duties and functions. When we moved from working in offices to working from home, working remotely, working under COVID-19, most institutions, in a lot of ways, loosened the reins on how they operated and what employees did because they were trying to make things work. And that resulted in some people doing things very differently than they had. Does that mean going forward that these are the new job duties? It means it's not the new job duties. I've told most of my clients they should evaluate all the job duties of their employees, and evaluate whether or not they need to change. And sometimes that results in eliminating some jobs. It might result in them deciding that some jobs can have new functions, essential marginal functions. Idea is, what has worked today? What will work going forward? And how do we plan long-term according to that? You need to look at accommodation demands today. Did you meet those accommodations? Are accommodations still existing? Are accommodations going to be needed going forward? You need to very much evaluate that. Have you failed to do so and create legal concerns? EEO concerns, very big issue. In a lot of ways, a lot of people might have made mistakes. We've heard earlier in the day about the possibility that some people were high risk, people who were, heart conditions, over 60. And to the degree that you might have done things in a gratuitous manner to accommodate those people might have created exposure for you. So you need to look very carefully at that. Traditional labor issues, union relations, bargaining, protected concerted activity, those need to be considered. Have you violated those rules? Have you violated OSHA, followed the OSHA policies and safety policies? You need to understand where you are at before you start planning out how you go forward, because it might have financial ramifications moving forward. So looking at, should revise our moving forward plan. I'm going to turn over the program now to Lisa Damon, who is going to give some more perspective on that.
Great. Thanks a lot, Daryl. I really appreciate it. So as Daryl said, he set us up really nicely for talking about why is a plan necessary. I think my guess is you've all got a plan, you're all thinking about it, but if you're a little behind the curve, it's important that you do a comprehensive business plan. We're going to talk about sort of the various iterations of that, but this well-crafted moving forward plan kind of gives you the basis to make all of your various business decisions. I think that from a legal perspective, the two things that I would sort of leave you with as we look at this slide is you need to focus on your business reasons. So start there. What is, as Daryl said, what are you trying to accomplish? What do you want to do? What do you want your people to do? How can your business look different? This is a very important time for that. And secondly, and we're going to talk about this over and over and over again, is this issue of communication. So while you're thinking of your plan and you're getting your plan in place, you want to make sure that you've got communication threaded throughout all of it. And again, we'll talk about that again and again. A lot of people who are, as they're determining who should come back, it's important, I think, again, from a legal perspective, to move out of what to me is very paternalistic. We're going to let the women stay home because they have childcare. We're going to let the older people stay back because they are in vulnerable positions. We're going to talk about the EO considerations yesterday, but I think it's very important here too to really focus in on your business reasons. Why are people coming back? Many of the employers that we all work for are giving people an option if they can come back because they have only certain numbers that can come in every day. That's one way to do it, to make it voluntary. But then be careful. If people need accommodations, be flexible. And again, you're going to hear that over and over from us as we talk about this, that flexibility is the most important thing as you're putting together a plan. Daryl, the next one. So we're going to pause on this issue of fear for a little bit. Daryl, can you move it? Yeah, thanks. Fear, we're finding at least from the employer side, is playing an enormous role in what's happening. Employees are afraid, employers are afraid. And so dealing with this fear factor right up front is incredibly important. There's a really good HBR article that came out called Helping Employees Manage Reentry Anxiety. There are lots of things that have been written about this. Sort of the things that everybody is thinking about are the communication, and we'll talk more about that, making sure that the communication is routine, that is accurate, it's timely, it's transparent. There's a lot of communication that employers were doing when we first hit the pandemic that they've now backed away from. Employees are feeling, they tell us as employers that we are holding information back. They're not feeling safe. Remember, your job is to make your employees feel safe. And the way to do that is to make sure they understand what the benefits are that they have, what you're doing, how you're managing, are you cleaning the workplace, things like that. React quickly. A lot of employers are doing what they call reentry boot camps. I'll give you just a couple of examples. We've got one employer who has an online training for people coming back, which employees have told us they like that. They like to know that everybody's gotten the training. But then there are trainings being done for things like managing teams in this new environment, or how you can build your career as an employee when many people are still remote. So think about what kinds of things you can do that reduce people's anxiety, that their careers are on hold, that they're not safe at work, that they may be subject to furloughs and layoffs. So be careful there. And again, everything in this world is about flexibility, you being flexible as an employer. Let me stop for a second. Melissa, anything to add there? Can't hear you.
Tell me, listen.
Can everyone hear me now?
We
Yes, ma'am.
can.
Okay, thank you. So from an employee side perspective, I'd say fielding employee concerns post-COVID has really ramped up. And I'd say unequivocally, the employee fear factor comes up as the most reoccurring employee concern post-COVID. Specifically, employees will ask, do I have the right to work from home if I'm uncomfortable reporting to my job, even if I'm not sick? And unfortunately, we do have to advise these employees that there is no legal right to telecommuting, as employers do have the right to dictate the terms of employment. Of course, if there is an underlying disability that puts an employee at high risk for coronavirus, they may have the right to telecommute as a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. And we'll discuss that in a few moments, but unfortunately, the fear factor alone is not enough. And that's something that's important for the employer and employees council, if any, to inform the employee at the outset. But I do think it's a good business practice, as Lisa mentioned, to over communicate with your employees and let them know what their rights are and what the employer is doing to alleviate some of those fears.
Great. Pam, did you have anything to add there?
Yes, absolutely. So I agree with the comments that have been made so far, but speaking as someone who represents unions, obviously in a unionized workplace where the workers have selected a union to be their representative, that's an important distinction. And I'm here to really encourage all employers and employer council on the phone to really partner with the union. It's actually, you know, partnering with the union is going to be incredibly helpful for both you and your employees in managing the fear factor and in managing the going forward plan. I mean, first of all, you're likely to have a collective bargaining agreement in place, and that's going to address a lot of the who, what, when, where, how, those issues that you're going to have to think about when you first start to develop the plan. So you're going to have to look at that collective bargaining agreement. There also might be a duty to bargain over certain things that you're considering, changes in policies, changes in procedures, rules, even compensation. And while, you know, based on, you know, recent activity by the Trump Labor Board, such as the MV Transportation case or the GC memo on bargaining during emergency circumstances, you might be able to construct a legal argument for why you don't have to bargain, but that's not going to be the best strategy. Your best strategy is to really partner with the union to allay concerns, make sure that communications are flowing and are addressing the rank and file union member concerns, and really basically making sure that workers have a fundamental baseline confidence that the workplace is safe and that they're not going to be brought back to that workplace until it is safe.
I can follow up on that, Pam, since I represent management and negotiations. I agree. We should be reaching out to unions and having conversations. But I would encourage in some of these efforts, I found the unions sometimes are resistant. And I think on a certain degree, there's got to be flexibility on behalf of everybody in the situation. And understanding we're in untried territory. There is no clear cut. And in fact, when we negotiated collective bargaining agreements, none of us negotiated the agreements with in mind to be facing a circumstance we have right now. And there might be need for departures from the rigidity of what the contract might have called for. And there might be openness. I mean, I'm finding sometimes with some unions are being resistant because, well, you know, managers should be able to figure it out. Sometimes it's not possible to figure out. This is brand new territory. I mean,
Yeah.
from the perspective of employers, employees, and unions, this is untried, unknown territory. We haven't had a health crisis like this in over 100 years. And there's got to be a lot of flexibility, a lot of openness to amending and managing things. I mean, I think part and parcel of the memos you mentioned that came out of GC Peter Robb is the fact idea of emergency operations being allowed to happen, decisions being made because of the situation of the urgency of getting things done. You got to get it, you got to get things done. You can't wait hey, let me give the union notice and go through a bargaining of 2 or 3 weeks to get to something that might be amenable. You might have to move fast. And I think it's important to reach out to the unions, but it's equally important for both parties to understand expedience,
Sure.
stability is going to be necessary.
Sure. And I found that the unions that I work with do recognize that. And unfortunately, there are examples of employers that just unilaterally implement things and move forward, and it wreaks havoc in the workplace. So, that's never a good idea. And, I see a lot of cooperation other than those instances, which unfortunately are out there. I see more cooperation than lack of cooperation. And I encourage that.
To add on, because I think the communication around workers feeling safe is incredibly important. I do think as we move through the return to work, making sure that employees understand what the resources are. So for instance, we have a couple of clients who are really focusing on the mental health benefits that they offer in addition to the health wellness programs, all kinds of things, really moving the communication beyond maybe what we started with. The other thing, I'll mention this, and we're going to talk about it later in the EEO section, but I personally, and I know many clients, have real concerns about the impact of all of this right now on the diversity efforts in the workplace. And I think that the communication extends to, one, certainly childcare. How are people going to manage? We see women stepping out of the workforce right now because they don't see a path forward. And part of that is communication. People who are concerned about their career paths. They don't see a path forward because they're not part of the return to work. They're at home, they're remote, they're not feeling connected. So I think this is a much bigger issue as we move along, and really should be a big piece of what employers are concerned about right now. Next slide, Daryl. I think, Pam, it's to you now.
Yes, let's see what that slide is. Yes, reevaluating business operations going forward. So obviously deciding how to run the business is, that's in management's court. They're going to make those decisions. But there are things that you're going to have to keep in mind when considering how you're going to be evaluating. So changes in the size of the workforce, changes in policies, changes in positions. Again, as I said in the last segment, if you have a union, you most likely have a collective bargaining agreement. Most likely that collective bargaining agreement is going to address how positions are maintained, what are bargaining unit positions. Some collective bargaining agreements even address, new or modified positions, et cetera. You're going to have to deal with the union if you're going to be combining or modifying positions. You're going to have to, and you're going to want to as well. Because again, as Daryl said, cooperation is key. Moving forward during a pandemic, we are, at least in New York here, we're in a much better stage of the pandemic than we were before. And if you're considering restarting operations now, you're going to want to, really work with the union on that. There are big problems, as I said, when management proceeds without notice. There's a loss of confidence by the employees in their employer. There's a loss of morale. You're going to find that employees are reluctant to return to a workplace where there have been a lot of changes and their union hasn't been involved and there haven't been communications. So again, even though this sort of falls within, management's rights in deciding how to run the business, know your collective bargaining agreement, reach out to the union and have a collaborative process. Whether it's using an existing labor management committee or whether you have a COVID return to work committee. I mean, here I'm spearheading the return to work efforts here at my own law firm, and we have a return to work committee that includes employees in various classifications. And it's something that we're seeing at other workplaces as well. So Lisa, I'm wondering if you want to share your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so let me just talk a little bit, because we are seeing a lot of employers right now take this opportunity to change the composition of the workforce in terms of numbers or locations, closing geographic locations, that sort of thing. It makes sense from a business standpoint for a lot of people. They've seen how things have worked. They're looking to reduce their physical footprint. There can be a million things that are generating it. I think one of the things, though, that I see some employers who are moving so fast that they are forgetting kind of the rules of the road on workforce reductions. WARN Act, for instance. One of the things that I do in my life is I monitor COVID litigation, sort of trying to understand where the trends are. That this is an area, employers who have not followed appropriately the WARN issues, a lot of litigation here, a tremendous amount. So be sure you're consulting with your lawyers, your inside and outside lawyers, to be sure you're doing this right. But you want to make sure that you're following WARN. Also, just recall that workforce size may go up and down depending on where we are in the pandemic. So be flexible in your planning. Furlough may be a better way to go than layoffs or restructurings. But it's certainly a hot issue right now as we deal with clients across the country. Okay, next slide. I think Daryl is fine.
If I can add in there, we mentioned the slide here about when you're doing your plan, you should be doing your plan at an earlier stage. What I've seen some clients do is you can't do the planning when you're in the need to do something. You should be doing evaluation at the earliest stage. You're looking at your job positions and your titles. You should be looking at a position, not an individual. That's a mistake. When you start looking at individuals, you create a problem, potential disparate treatment. So what I've told my clients to do is evaluate every single position job description. Evaluate how it operates, what it operates, and whether or not that needs to make a change, not based upon how individuals handling that job. I've also made it very clear they need to be looking at how they're going to operate as it applies to the vendors coming in, their clients, if it's medical facility patients, anyone else coming to the facility. You need to do a holistic plan that includes everything, not just an emergency sort of knee-jerk reaction to things they develop. If you plan this out correctly, you will mitigate some of the fear concerns, and you'll be also in a better place when you go in. If you have a union, to talk to the union, you'll be better basically educated to be able to explain to the union why you need to make certain changes. And I don't think because you have a collective bargaining agreement in place that might have certain terms, you should be hesitant to go to the union and say, we need to make changes. Because in the end of the day, everybody's interest for institutions to survive and prosper. And if there are provisions in your collective bargaining that are going to hinder the ability for the institution to prosper and do well long term, they need to be changed, because what was in place pre-COVID might not work now in the COVID environment and might mandate change.
And let me just add there, the union and the employer have the same, fundamental concerns there, which is ensuring the safety of the workers and ensuring the ongoing viability of the employer, because, obviously that's in their best interest as well. So I think, Daryl's right, there needs to be collaboration. And I think for the most part, you're going to find that there's a willingness to do that. Let me just point out one other thing in terms of business operations going forward. Unions are seeing an increased number of employers coming to the union to discuss shared work arrangements. So in lieu of layoffs, doing a reduction where everybody in a unit or a department is working a reduced schedule and getting unemployment benefits as well, getting paid for the days they're working, getting unemployment benefits. And that's something that requires the cooperation of the union. And we were seeing quite a bit of that during different stages of the pandemic. And I'm sure that that's playing out in different parts of the country where things are a little bit hotter than they are in New York right now. But there was a lot of collaboration and cooperation around that.
Keep in mind too that when you do reduction in force or furlough, and you might be doing something where a person's working only part-time versus being a full-time employee, you can work out ranges with your local government's unemployment insurance bureau. Several of them have provisions that allow for employees to be on partial unemployment insurance coverage while working still part-time.
Right, that's what I was referring to.
Yeah, goes to the creativity needed right now, I think.
And we've got it, and this requires creativity, no question about it.
Yeah.
Next slide, right?
Yeah, next slide. So we're going to touch on EEO issues again later. We wanted to have a slide though really devoted to reasonable accommodations. Obviously, this is an enormous part of everybody's job who's involved in bringing employees back right now, trying to separate out what is required for reasonable accommodation, what is not. I think one of the things, and we talked about it before, is just encouraging, if you're working with employers, to be as flexible as possible. But sort of, rules of the road. You want, if someone's coming to you for a reasonable accommodation request, the first thing is your process should be very well defined. This is a really good time, if you've done them sort of on an ad hoc basis before, this is a good time to stop and make sure that you have a very clear process. Employees know where they need to go. You have a central person or people who are reviewing those accommodation requests so that they're not sort of springing up all across the country and doing things on their own. So get a process in place as you go forward. Be as flexible as you can be. Clearly, I think we all know that just because we've all been working remotely and continue to do that, many of us, doesn't mean that this is the new reasonable accommodation. The law is clear that just because we've been doing it doesn't mean we have to do it forever or need to allow reasonable accommodation going forward, but it's going to be part of the equation. I mean, if an employee has been able to do their job satisfactorily, remotely, and that is a request for reasonable accommodation, the question will be, well, how have you been managing and what has been the problem? Have they been able to do those essential functions? So be ready for that conversation. Be thinking about it as you go into the discussions with your employees. Still very, very necessary to have those discussions, to collaborate with the employee, to listen, to be sensitive, reminding yourself that you're going to be asked for accommodations based not only on physical need, but also on mental need. Employees who may have mental health issues, employees who may have special needs in terms of disabilities, hypersensitivity to things like anxiety may come up. Totally rational, reasonable to have reasonable accommodations granted. Make sure your committees are sort of aware of that. Daryl mentioned this early on. I think it's right. It's a great time to evaluate your jobs, your job descriptions. What are essential functions? What are marginal functions? I think we've all gotten a whole new worldview on what actually might be essential. So take this time, look at that. It's good for your business. It's good for your employees as you go forward. Pre-existing health conditions you see on the slide there, people are going to bring that to the table now. They have a pre-existing condition that may not have needed an accommodation before, and they may be needing that now. Melissa, you're going to weigh in here a little bit?
Yeah, so first of all, most of us are familiar with the EEOC guidance on reasonable accommodations that could offer protection to an individual whose disability or pre-existing health condition, as Lisa pointed out, puts them at greater risk from COVID-19. I'd say that from our perspective, what makes the COVID-19 request for accommodations unique is that a lot of times we're dealing with employers who advise us that due to the constraints imposed by the pandemic itself, they're unable to provide an accommodation. And while this might have been doable pre-COVID, it's just not possible now. So we've been using the word creativity a lot during this presentation, and it's important because we do have to engage in ongoing creative dialogue, because this is unlike any other situation, to determine, even with the constraints imposed by the pandemic, which accommodations may meet an employee's needs on a temporary basis without causing undue hardship on the employer. What I would caution from a plaintiff's counsel perspective is for the employer not to rely on undue hardship, even those exacerbated by COVID, without fully exploring the gamut of possibilities, particularly since COVID has changed the landscape of what is considered an essential job function. So for example, while physical presence may have been considered an essential job function for some roles pre-COVID, if there are any like or similar positions that are now operating in a remote capacity, it will be much more difficult to make that argument. And on the final point that Lisa mentioned, I just want to share an observation that we're seeing in our practice, and that's that a lot of employees with pre-existing mental health conditions, for example, anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, may have more difficulty handling the disruption to daily life that has accompanied the COVID-19 pandemic. It's not just necessarily employees with physical disabilities or compromised immune systems, and that's important to take into consideration during the interactive process.
And just to pick up on that, because it ties back to what we said earlier, the stream of communications, making them fulsome, making it transparent, making employees feel as if you're communicating and you have their best interests may help. But you can imagine someone with pre-existing anxiety disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, this is so hard right now. So doing everything you can to make that easier. And for if you're an employer, counseling employers, just to remind yourselves that you don't have to, if somebody asks you for something that you can't give, no is not where you stop. You have to go beyond that. No, but let's think. Here are my constraints. Here's what you need. What can we do? Creative and flexible.
If I can just chime in, Lisa, again, let me urge people, particularly institutions, you need to do the evaluation of those essential marginal functions way in advance of any particular employee's particular unique situation. Because if you designate a position and look at the position very carefully, what does this position have? What was my pre-COVID description of the person, essential marginal? What is it that works now? We're gonna face as employers a lot of people coming up and saying, well, I don't understand. During the COVID-19 period, I did X, Y, and Z on a remote basis and it all worked fine. And now you're telling me that I'm not meeting my requirements. I don't understand. I think it's imperative that to the degree you're going people back and moving them forward, that you convey to them that during this period, we allowed a departure from the normal essential function of the job because of the uniqueness of the situation. Please be advised going forward, we need the full performance of the essential function of the job, which include A, B, C. Again, it's communication to the employees so they understand, because if all they see is you're saying no now and before it seemed yes, it's going to seem like you're being cold-hearted, you're being dismissive of their potential issues, and you're not being reasonable. So you have to make sure people understand why it is you're determining at this stage of the game an essential function might be working in the office versus working remotely. And there are going to be a lot of, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, sorry, Daryl. And I would just say that I think Daryl's correct that you do have to analyze this way in advance. But I think the other caveat to that is that if you've allowed a remote workforce for a sustained period of time, I think the argument does become more difficult that it is an essential job function. So even if it is analyzed way in advance, you may have to reevaluate it post-COVID and ask yourself as an employer, this was considered an essential job function, but we've been operating in this capacity for 9 months. Is it really an essential job function? Is it something that we should reconsider?
So this would not be a good discussion between plaintiff and management parties unless we have a little bit of disagreement, of course. And I would point out that I don't disagree with her at all, but I would point out what you should be prepared to do is point out how, while during the COVID-19 period, you did allow essential functions that were crucial to the job. You need to be able to explain how the company or institution suffered in performance-wise because those things were not done. Because otherwise, it's maybe not an essential function. So you should say, if a person needs to be in office to do X, why being X during the past period would have been important, but why you allowed it to go forward because of the unique situation that was going forward because of the COVID period. Just don't say, well, we always like to have it, we should have it now. You're going to have to be able to quantify what was lost in the company's production or the employees' productivity because they did not perform those functions you now going to claim are essential. Oh, I'm going to be toward that. All right, so moving forward, now we've got this work plan. We've thought about the work site. We've thought about how people coming back, bringing people back to work. We now have this whole new brave world of people being tested. Like you're like me, everywhere you go, people want to take your temperature, want to ask how you're doing, want to ask how you've been, want to ask where you've been. And unlike what might be the normal circumstances, you can do that. With the pandemic guidance that came out of the EEOC, you are allowed to ask a host of questions. Those who have not yet reviewed it, I very much urge you to do that, as well as you check your local FEP agencies, who might be state or city municipalities, to see whether or not they're in compliance or in agreement also. For example, in New York City, COVID-19 is deemed to be a disability in of itself, versus the EEOC doesn't necessarily view COVID-19 as a disability. It might be the symptom factors might make it a disability, but just being COVID-19 positive doesn't make it disabled. New York City, it does. But you are allowed to engage in things like, testing people when they were coming to work. You're allowed to check and ask if they have symptoms. You're allowed to even decide to decline to allow someone to have a job if they've had COVID-19 and have the symptoms along. So these are things you need to keep in mind in going through the work site, is how do you bring people back? Because again, people also, co-workers, want to make sure that they are working with people who are not sick and they're not being exposed to sickness.
Right.
Safety protocols. I don't know about every jurisdiction, but a lot of jurisdictions have created what they might call specific rules, like New York calls it New York Forward, where they might have laid out what they expect every employee to do to make sure the place is safe. You need to make sure you've got those cleaning protocols in place, the PPE necessary. We talk about social distancing. It's at 6 feet, 4 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, with the aerosol factor. I've heard the 6 feet is just sort of a mystical factor, but not really sufficient to give safety. But, again, it's required by the law, at least in New York. Customer patient safety. When customers are coming in, how are you making sure they're safe from potential exposure and people working with you? How are you making sure they're safe from other people who might be coming in? How are you making sure that your employees are safe from the customers or the clients that are coming into your facility? You need to be keeping all this in mind. You need to lay out protocols. In my opinion, should be written protocols explaining what's there, and those protocols should be shared with your employees so the employees are aware not only of what they need to do and how they do, but also to make sure they can address their concern. Because if they hear what you're doing, if they hear how you're doing it, it'll help them feel more comfortable when it comes time to come to work. I very much believe, and have advocated my clients, they designate one or more employees in the operation to be a monitor, to make sure that these measures are being taken care of. Because if you don't have someone responsible making sure of the social distancing and making sure people are not cleaning facilities, making sure things are not being done, it won't happen. And you're going to have a problem with people not getting things done they should get done. You need to, meet with the building to ensure it's good and safe ventilation. You need to make sure that you're planning with the building how the elevator access is going to happen. I think there's some comment that's one to come from Pam and Melissa.
Yes. So let me jump in first, if you don't mind. These are all incredibly important issues. This is really the boots on the ground part of our discussion here. You've had your initial, thoughts about your plan, about coming back to work or ramping up operations. You've been developing your on-site work plan, and now you're really talking about those very tangible steps that you're going to take. Let me first say about testing. We've seen, as a union lawyer who represents essential workers, where the unions represent essential workers, there has been, such a changing set of guidance and requirements coming out of the CDC and other organizations regarding testing and screening. And I have to say, while testing is important, at times testing is not available that is going to be a rapid enough turnaround so that if you impose testing requirements, when the workers know that, they're not going to get the results of their test for 3 days, it's not going to make sense, and it's going to make them feel that you're imposing a nonsensical requirement that really isn't going to result in adequate assurances that the people who are coming back to work are actually COVID-free, because there's been this 3-day lag. Now, luckily, the testing is getting a little better. Some healthcare employers also are able to do the testing on site, which is a good thing. But the CDC for healthcare workers and other essential workers at different stages, they were urging people who had COVID, who were suspected or confirmed COVID positive, to have a test or more than one negative test before returning to work. But then they also had what they called a non-pet test-based strategy as well. And that involved, depending on what stage of the COVID process, the COVID pandemic we were in, they said you have to be, it has to be 7 days from when you first were diagnosed or from when you were first experiencing symptoms, and you have to be fever-free for 72 hours. So there are non-test-based strategies as well. As we move through a different stage of that pandemic, the 7 days then became 10 days, which then became 14 days. So, you have to keep an eye on what the CDC recommendations are. And while testing sounds good, sometimes employers have been implementing it in a way that doesn't actually result in the workers feeling assured about their own safety or the safety of their coworkers. So that's on testing. In terms of PPE, that is the #1 issue that we hear from union represented workers, particularly the healthcare workers and other essential workers. That is critically important. And again, I'm going to urge collaboration and cooperation with the union. In some of our unionized workplaces, there have not only been COVID committees and return to work committees, but there are committees that specifically meet to monitor the employer's supply of PPE, because healthcare workers experienced, devastating, terrifying times in the beginning of this pandemic when they were required to come to work and do their jobs with inadequate PPE, and they have heightened anxiety around that. So it's very important that they fully understand what PPE is available, that the workplace is being properly sanitized, and that the environmental controls are in place. So again, it's very important to partner with the unions if you can. It's very important communications, again, that you want your workforce to know what's in place and know that it's going to provide a safe work environment. Because if you're looking to ramp up operations or open up when you've been closed, you need employees who are willing to actually show up to work.
Yeah, so I'm in agreement with you, Pam. I just wanted to make a quick point on what we've been seeing with respect to testing. So clearly under the ADA, employers can require employees to take medical tests that are job related and consistent with business necessity. According to the EEOC guidance, keeping infected individuals from spreading the virus to coworkers is considered consistent with business necessity, and that includes electing to administer COVID-19 tests to employees before they enter the workplace to determine if they have the virus. The only additional point that I would add is for job applicants. We've had a handful of job applicants who contacted us stating that their employer is screening them for COVID-19, but not another applicant who applied for the same position. So of course, employers may screen job applicants for symptoms of COVID-19 after making a conditional job offer, as long as they do so for all employees with the same type of job. To do otherwise could set employers up for an intentional discrimination claim.
I would agree totally with Melissa that you've got to be consistent in how you apply. If you're requiring testing of some people, you got to apply of everybody. You can't selectively decide those of color are going to be tested because they come from communities that have high risk, or we're going to bring people into work who might be older because they might be high exposure. You just can't be inconsistent. You can't use a social classification as a base of differential treatment. I do think, to what Pam was saying, that the employer has to, the testing might be an issue. I think the testing most employers are doing today is they have them usually these apps on their phones where people have been required to fill out a certain number of questions. The same question we get when we go to hospitals and medical facilities these days. Have you been exposed? Have you been out of the country? Have you been in jurisdictions? Anyone been sick with COVID-19? Do you have any symptoms? And then they do the head temperature check, but they're making sure if you walk in the facility. I think all that's very permissible by the law, and I think very rational, and you've got to do that. And I've had some clients have to point out they cannot not do that because they're busy. They have to assign someone responsible to do this. So you might have to actually assign that task to an employee. So you're actually almost creating a new job function that didn't exist before COVID-19. You got to keep that in mind. Looking at some of the other things that I would say that you need to consider as you're going into the period is very important. You're considering everything about work. You got to keep in mind people getting to the actual work location, whether it be New York City or a place that people, if you're a city that depends on mass transit to get to work, and that's true, particularly a lot of times the low paid workers in the company, they require public transportation to get to work. You got to keep that in mind. How are they getting here? Is there going to be a rush factor? Do I need to stagger the hours of the schedule to make sure people aren't all being forced into the city subway system or to the public transportation system? Are they taking Ubers and Lyfts? How are they getting in? Can they afford to get Uber and Lyfts? They're parking. Are you going to pay for the parking? Are people parking? Are they going to park away from the block? Is that going to be an economic hit on people? So when you're planning to have people come back to work, keep in mind when you're deciding when you're going to bring them back on site, but remote. Part of the analysis and doing that also is the impact of how does this impact my people getting to work, and what impact will that put more of my people in jeopardy of getting COVID-19 was in putting them into a herd situation with a lot of other people who might be also sick. When you get to the office building itself, in a lot of buildings in a lot of cities, they have high towers, high office buildings that might have elevated needs to get in. And a lot of elevators you see where they might have everybody standing, no more than 4 people in an elevator. In a big building that has thousands and thousands of people, that might adversely affect the ability of people to get upstairs quickly. So you might have to have a line situation. So you have to also keep in mind when you're scheduling the workouts of people, do you have to have it staggered again to allow for the fact that people are coming up? Do you need to look with the building and say, listen, I have 3 floors. I want to have 1 elevator reserved just for my people. You need to be looking at those factors. If it's a break room, how are you going to have the break room handle and what's going to happen regarding that? When people are signing in, when you're having people clock in or have to sign in to work because they're on a situation where they're non-exempt and you have to have a record of their timekeeping. How are they signing in? How are they checking in? Will there be a line there? You need to plan all that in mind. When you're looking at people coming to work, they have to eat. They have to take breaks. When are they going to do that? Where are they going to do that? How are they having lunch? Are they having it at their desk? Are they having it somewhere else? Where's the food going to be? Is it going to be in the refrigerator? Will they be comfortable going to the refrigerator and getting food from somebody else that someone else has been in the refrigerator? Childcare. You have a lot of people who have children. And given the fact that right now in a lot of cities, schools still not open yet, what does that impact? So all these factors, logistics you have to take in mind when you're planning to bring people back on the site. What impact will that have on the ability for your workers to be able to come back to work and work comfortably and productively?
And can I just weigh in on that slide before you move
Please.
on? Sorry. Sure. These are key issues for unionized workers and the unions that I work mostly with, including a large healthcare workers union. And these are key issues. These are like the nuts and bolts issues that are going to impact whether people can come back to work and feel safe coming back to work. And unions have collaborated with employers around, putting together a program with Uber and Lyft, for example, to provide transportation alternatives, including, I'm thinking of 1199 with home care workers and other healthcare workers. And also with Airbnb providing lodging near the workplace in case workers, live with someone who's immune compromised, and the employer wants them to be showing up for work and feeling safe showing up for work. So there are all kinds of programs that unions have been working with employers to implement. Lunch and food storage, key. These are key things. Some of our best employer partners have actually, I know not every employer can do this, but they're providing food for employees on site, and making that possible, making childcare possible. Employers are working out arrangements with emergency childcare centers during the height of the pandemic here. When there were limited childcare options, there were emergency childcare centers open, and employers were, making arrangements to have slots available or to subsidize childcare or to give a voucher to employees. And in fact, I have to say, there's one employer in particular who was truly the best partner under very bad circumstances in the healthcare industry in New York City, who the union is going to profile in its upcoming magazine, because they did remarkable things and did it all on notice to the union and in collaboration with the union in terms of bonuses, childcare arrangements, free meals for everybody. They actually hired children of employees for the summer because summer programs, summer employment and camps were shut down. So they put together an initiative over the summer so that their employees' children could be gainfully employed and also learning, in a learning environment and in a recreation environment. They had shuttle buses. Again, as I said, hotels, Airbnb. And again, not every employer is going to be doing this, but, in hardship money, or if a bargaining unit member passed due to COVID, they made additional resources available for burial and for the family. So not every employer is going to be able to do this, but it was a tremendous collaboration with the union, and it was felt throughout the entire very large bargaining unit. And I have to say, as the employer is now moving forward and thinking, how is it going to continue to do its operations going forward, there's a lot of openness and flexibility from the union and from the membership. And, let's work together. Let's address your issues now, employer, and figure out how we can help you move into the next phase. So that's just a plug for doing everything you can to address these very important logistical issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Pam. And going along that line, looking at the other things you need to consider, even though there's been some questions now whether the virus stays on surfaces, there is still technology and findings. I've talked to many medical doctors that yes, it does stay on surfaces. You still can acquire the disease. You might not be the main way of acquiring it, you can. But most importantly, whether you can or can't, people still do believe that is a problem. So therefore, that fear, that FEAR word, which is that four-letter word that's become a major problem today dealing with getting people to go back to work, is there. So when you have people with computers, copy machines, common work areas, the kitchen, refrigerator, bathrooms, what are you doing to alleviate the concerns of people when it comes to feeling, if I go to use a computer, will I touch the computer and catch disease? If I go to the bathroom, some employees have required now in bathrooms, refrigerators, they've changed the sinks so that instead of having to use a handle, it's going to be automatic where it's sort of a sensor. You roll your hand on it and the water comes on immediately. Those things are being done. You've got to be bathrooms where no more than one person going to the bathroom at a time, but still, when the person goes in, the person comes out. Am I worried about when I go in the bathroom that the person before me might have left the disease? You're going to have people facing those concerns, so you're going to have to make sure, one, that you've done something to at least address that concern, some sanitation factor being done, more cleaning of the building, maybe instead of having cleaned once a day, clean 2 or 3 times a day. Maybe making it clear that you've got people have to use hand sanitizer going in and out of the bathroom. You got to make sure someone's responsible, monitoring, making sure that's done, because people have a tendency of getting caught in a day and being cavalier, and you don't. And just the same issue we have now across the country, where some people wearing masks, some not wearing masks, and that's creating friction across the country between the two sets of people. That's going to happen in the workplace too. We need to keep that in mind and try to alleviate that, because again, if you have people coming to the work site being afraid, they're not going to want to come on a regular basis. If you have people coming to the work site and fighting over these issues, it's going to create a morale problem and problems in your work site that's going to be non-productive and adversely affect your business operations. Finally, on this issue of one's worksite plan, I think it is so important when you lay all your plan out, you've got it all addressed, you figured out how you want to do things, you need to do a dry run. You just don't kind of say, I got the plan, okay, everybody back tomorrow. Because you need to start out with a very limited staff to see, how does this work? Does it work okay with the elevator situation? Does it work okay with the bathrooms, the kitchens? Does it work okay with the PPE? Do we have enough? Very limited staff, try it out, test it out, and then progressively increase the staff size going in until you get to your full complement of people on the work site. That's the way you get it going and make it operate well. Pam, Melissa, you guys have any more comments in this area? Want to move forward?
Yeah, let's move forward.
Now, we talked about on-site work planning. We're not going to spend a lot of time, in fact, much time also going to be remotely working, because we have a whole separate seminar, which is going to be this Thursday from 12:32, which is another panel of people are going to be talking about remote working. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time. But I want to touch a couple of things in case some people aren't able to make Thursday's program. One, you need to decide who's going to work remotely, not based upon individuals, unless it is a part of an accommodation factor. It should be based upon titles. You should be deciding this position with these job duties and functions can do remote, and we're going to have these people doing remote, and these people will not be. And because you got to be very conscious of that fact. You need to arrange the plan of provision of supplies to those people. How are you going to get the supplies to do their work? If there's a question regarding reimbursement, I've heard people say, well, since I'm working from home, how come my employer is not paying my rent? How come they're not paying for my telephone bill? Why are they paying for my, internet? And there's a requirement, if you require as an employer for people to buy new equipment or to get a better set of internet, you have to pay for the additional costs. You should set a plan for dress code. I've been on Zoom calls and Teams calls, and I'm shocked sometimes when people who are doing business are coming in on sweatsuits or coming in on T-shirts that look like they, and let's just say, less than professional. If you're an employee, you want your people to represent you, you should be establishing them what, even on a Zoom call, even though you work from home, here's what expect of you to wear when you work on this, coming on these calls. To the degree you have people working on confidential documents, Pam mentioned healthcare. You've got people using medical records, medical documents. They might be living in a household with other people. You got to understand there are restrictions and things about those documents other people are supposed to see. You should have in place an understanding of how to treat those documents, how to properly secure them so they're not going to be potentially seen by people who should not see them. You should even talk to employees where they're going to be working remotely. I think managers should be talking to employees and discussing this, because where they're working remotely, the people in apartments might have limited space, but you should talk to them about that. In addition, if people are working remotely, for example, if you've got a New York employee who's decided to go to North Carolina or Pennsylvania or to another state to work remotely, and then you as an employee know they're working remotely for an extended time period, you might as an employer now have a duty to buy workers' comp for them in that jurisdiction. In fact, that we've determined and identified in some jurisdictions, some municipalities, is even requirement to file a certain permit requirement in those municipalities if a person is working remotely. So there's a lot of factors, and also tax ramifications for a long time remotely that you might need to keep in mind. And you also might want to look what software is available to help manage. There's various software that I'm quite sure Pam and Jacob and Melissa are not going to like, but allow you to manage and monitor closely how your people are working, how attentive they're being, and whether or not they're being productive. We're gonna now look to go forward a little more. I think
I think my slide, we've talked about this a lot and we're running a little bit late, so I want to make sure we catch up. Just to summarize what we've said about communication, I think about two things. I think about the cadence. How often do you want to communicate? Make it regular. And sort of 4 buckets of things to communicate. So we've talked about safety. We've talked about mental and physical health benefits. We've talked about resources, the people, the team. How do people get help? How do they ask for reasonable accommodations? One we haven't really talked about that I think is important in the communication is the health of the business. People want to know what's happening. Do I need to be afraid? So I would consider that as you go forward. Next slide, Daryl. And I think also we've talked about this, but planning a contingency plan going forward. Hopefully we're not going to have this predicted November wave, but it may happen. So you see there the bullets. Pay attention to a contingency plan. Figure out what you need if and when this happens again. I think the PPE for essential workers obviously is incredibly important, but also a plan to get everybody back home and get it quickly. I just call out the productivity management systems. Daryl mentioned this a little bit. I see employers kind of slightly panicky about how they're monitoring productivity, and I would just ask everybody to take a deep breath and go back to the way we've always done it. In ways that make sense and are calm and collected and involve regular performance appraisals. But let me give it to Pam for a second, and then we'll move to John. Pam?
Yeah, so let me first talk about the contingency plan issue. This is critically important. Once workers come back, people live through very difficult times, obviously, in the earlier stages of the pandemic, and they fear returning there. I mean, I know that we have people all across the country on this webinar, and unfortunately, some of you are in states where, community spread is still extremely high, but there's a huge fear factor. And once you bring people back, they do not want to fear that things will go back to the way it was in the beginning, should there be an uptick in cases. And again, I'm going to put in a plug for collaborating with the union. If you have labor management committee, or a lot of our unions have a health and safety committee in the contract, these are very important committees and processes to make sure that the employees feel confident going forward. They feel confident that there's going to be sufficient PPE and other supplies that they need. That is key. And we don't have to move back to the earlier slide, but Lisa again touched on communications to employees. This is something related to PPE, an example of how communications are key. Earlier on, when employees were coming back, while cases were still surging here, there was a lot of interest among employees in wearing gloves. And people were wearing gloves at work, and at a certain point, management determined that particularly in certain positions, it didn't make sense for employees to wear gloves, and actually that could be in a sense more hazardous, because then your gloves become like your hands, and if you're not changing your gloves, there are concerns there, because while you're washing your hands, you have a false sense of security when you're wearing gloves. So managers were yelling at employees, telling them that they can't wear gloves, but it hadn't been communicated. The health and safety issues behind that were not communicated to the workers, and the workers were up in arms. I mean, they were ready to, stay home, call out. They didn't want to come to work. And the union and the union's health and safety staff were able to work with the employer in making sure that appropriate communications were shared to get over that hurdle, so everyone was on the same page. So another plug for good communications, particularly around PPE and everything involved in staying safe at the workplace.
John?
Sure. When we were thinking about this panel, one of the things that folks thought might be interesting would be to hear from one company what their approach to a lot of these issues has been. I'm with Marsh & McLennan, and our experience has been probably not too dissimilar from what the experience of so many folks on the panel and in our audience has really been. The first thing though that I think of is that ancient curse, may you live in interesting times, because I feel like we are living in such an extraordinary time, and for employers, it's like nothing that we've seen before. First off, a little bit of background on Marsh & McLennan. MMC is a professional services firm with over $15 billion in annual revenue. We do business with in about 130 countries. We've got 75,000 employees, about half of them in the US, half of them outside, really spread across the globe. Our businesses, some of which you may have heard of or done business with, Marsh, Mercer, Guy Carpenter, and Oliver Wyman. MMC really was fortunate that it had the IT infrastructure, really the capacity to move when the pandemic hit, to move from working in the office to working primarily remotely, essentially overnight. And since then, some offices in various jurisdictions around the globe have returned to the office, at least to some degree. In the US, the vast majority of our employees continue to work remotely, but in many locations, we've started the process of returning to the office. Early on, the company created a cross-functional pandemic team, a COVID-19 cross-functional team to develop guidelines and manage planning with respect to the pandemic and the return to the office. Leadership really created a communication strategy early on, and one of the primary things that they decided was that transparency and frequency were going to be keys to this. It's really reflected in the way that we've gone about communicating with the workforce. We have posted our COVID-19 return to work plan on our website. We have a number of resources and communications on our employee website. We also have, we've had many emails, video communications. There's a sense that, as folks have discussed, that employees are feeling in the dark. They're reading all sorts of things on social media and in the newspapers, and seeing a lot online, and they've got questions. The sooner that that an employer can communicate and convey information about plans, about what they are planning to do, what they're not planning to do, and really communicate information about the business, that's really essential. And that's been the principles of transparency and frequency have really been at the heart of MMC's communication strategy. We've also had, we can go on to the next slide, that's great. MMC's really had a gradual phased approach to returning to the work site. And that's not unlike, I'm sure, what many law firms and many other companies have approached these issues, the way that they've approached these issues. Our plan is set forth in a document that's called Together Safely, our Office Restart Playbook for Leadership, HR, and Response Teams. It's really the company's health and safety plan and guidance for reopening safely and returning to in-office working. It's providing guidance for managers, for HR people, for local response teams on how to organize the return to work. The thing that's interesting to me is that it's posted on the COVID-19 company website. So when it comes to transparency, we don't just have a plan that is, secret from employees or withheld from employees. We've really put a pretty detailed set of guidelines and plans right up on our website for employees to see. So if employees have questions, how are we going to return to work? How are we going to manage this? That's really right out there for employees. And we've shared that really with the entire workforce globally. And I think that that's had an enormous impact on employees feeling comfortable that the company isn't really trying, to hide anything in terms of its planning or its basic principles. The principles that are really paramount and set forth in the plan. One is that the key priority is going to be employee health and safety. It's right up front. There's really no question about it. It really prioritizes respecting the advice and the requirements that official governments, the local governments and health authorities are promulgating, so that each office is really going to be focusing on the guidance that is applicable to it. It also emphasizes that significant work can be accomplished through virtual work arrangements, and that remote work can continue to be utilized as appropriate and as necessary, depending on how this unfolds. It really empowers local leaders. We have hundreds of offices around the globe, and the plan really empowers local leaders to manage risks and adjust to evolving conditions, to focus on local planning and responsiveness, not on central management from the corporate center, apart from really general principles on how we're going to move forward. It really seems like every state, every locality in the US and in every country around the globe has different standards for what constitutes a safe return to the workplace. And so we need to work through that maze of regulations with an emphasis on local teams managing local requirements. And I think the plan really recognizes that flexibility needs to be key, balancing the needs of employees and the business needs at the office level, at the individual office level, that's really key to what this is all about. On the COVID-19 website, the MMC website, there's really a myriad of plans, resources, communications. I checked back in the other day to see if there had been any updates, and there's a new section now on for managers and for employees on additional resources on working remotely, for example. The plan for reopening and returning to in-office working is there, but there are also detailed frequently asked questions about the return to the office process in which we're going to be engaged on a myriad of detailed issues. There are videos from our CEO, other communications from various leaders about various subjects. These are updated and supplemented on an ongoing basis. There's also, really for all of our employees to have access to, we've posted guidance and information on COVID-19 from government and health agencies. And we've also posted resources on physical and mental health. I think there's been an increasing emphasis on supporting employees with respect to mental health issues, so that there are resources and really focused information on our employee resource assistance program, and strategies for coping with the anxieties and some of the challenges that individual employees may be experiencing, not only with respect to themselves, but with respect to their family members and the many challenges that individuals are facing during this particularly difficult time. Another thing that the company did early on was to establish a support fund related to COVID-19, and it infused millions of dollars into this fund for financial support for colleagues who were impacted by COVID-19. And so on the website, there is information about that, guidelines on that, an application form on that as well. So that's been really, I think, a wonderful resource and source of support for a number of folks whose spouses and other family members may have experienced significant difficulties during this period. And then there's an employee community page as well that has communications, dialogue, features, and stories that are posted by employees so that employees can be connected with each other at a time of really enormous isolation for so many of us working remotely. The playbook and all of the resources that are on the website really addressed many safety and operational issues. And this includes a lot of logistical issues about returning to the office. It has a lot of resources about remote working, about childcare issues, issues that folks may face with other household members and family members, leaves of absence, remote work, all kinds of information, as well as training and guidance for employees. One of the things that it also addresses, and that we've addressed in kind of a unique way, goes to screening and testing with respect to re-entering the workplace. We have developed an app for that, actually. And it really is an app that serves a kind of gatekeeper function for folks who are entering the office, whether they're returning to the office for the first time or they are returning on a daily basis throughout the pandemic. The app requires that every employee answer a series of questions about, you're answering questions about yourself, you're answering questions about your situation, your personal situation, your specific individual situation, about your potential contact with COVID-19, and about your office logistics as well. There are going to be questions about your health, your temperature, your exposure to COVID-19, how you're feeling on a particular day. And at the end of all of this, the app will give you really a sign. It will either give you a green light or a red light. Either you should continue to work remotely or you're set to come into the office, in essence. And the app has been rolled out in the US, and it's in the process of being rolled out globally. There are a number of other considerations globally with respect to privacy, and we've worked with works councils and other representative groups to tailor the app to the specific legal requirements that we faced, of course, in various jurisdictions around the globe. But one of the things that we see this doing, of course, is facilitating an easier entry into the workplace as people actually enter the office. It will, we believe, it will cut down on waiting time and really facilitate, entry to the office in a really sensible and optimal way. Other issues, there there are also on the website, there's information on details and arrangements for facilitating returning to work. Everything from facility considerations, working patterns, whether it be split teams, social distancing, ensuring that people have an understanding of their obligations and the requirements for social distancing within the office. There's also information on office issues and visits and meetings, on travel, really trying to manage all of the questions and the issues that might come up and provide useful information. I think, one of the things that we've tried to emphasize most of all is flexibility. I think we've also tried to emphasize responsiveness. Our ability to respond to employee concerns, I think, is really, really important. And I think despite all the advanced planning, all the resources, all the continuing communications, I think we realize that this is a work in progress, that we need to be flexible and we need to be responsive to the workforce. I think a crisis like this really can reveal the values of an organization. And I think one of the things that we've kept in mind is that if your employees and your clients see an organization with values that they admire, your organization is much more likely to come out of the crisis stronger than it was before. That's really been our general approach. And again, it's a work in progress, and we'll see how this goes. We are all obviously hoping for the best and prepared to address whatever challenges come forward.
Daryl, we can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Thank you, John. Before we proceed, let me just note a couple of things. One, you'll note we have some handouts, including the PowerPoint. There's a reset of resources of materials we've all provided. So would be alerts from our first or other materials we thought might be helpful for people to use, access. We also include a memo put out by Peter Robb on Friday regarding NLRB perspective on various issues on collective bargaining, 8A1 violations, protecting concerted activity. That just came out this Friday. And we also have a CLE credit form of those who want to get CLE credit. And for that purpose this time, they give you the CLE number. The CLE number for this seminar is SS9551. Once more, SS9551. There's been a couple of questions. We'll hopefully get to those, but we've got a little more to cover. So I'm going to turn the program over to Pam.
Okay, thank you. And I note that we are running out of time, so we're going to move quickly through our remaining slides in the hopes of being able to take some questions. And the slide that we just moved past was a list of legal considerations. Some of them we've already touched on. Some of them we're going to touch on in the next few slides. And hopefully, I think the PowerPoint is in the materials that you can access, so you can see that list. So at this point, I'm just going to hand it over to Melissa to talk to us about leaves of absence.
Before you do that, John, there was a request. One of the questions was, who makes the app that you guys are using?
And the answer to that is that we do. Our business, Oliver Wyman, has developed the app, and it's been a long time in making, and it's also capable of being tailored to individual work sites depending on the individual requirements for screening and testing and the preferences of management at individual sites.
Thank you.
Okay, so with respect to leaves of absences, you'll see that there are generally 3 types of leaves of absences that we're going to be dealing with. So with respect to an employee's leave of absence due to personal illness, we're pretty much aware, we're all aware that if it's a leave of absence due to that employee's own illness, they will either have to seek FMLA, 12 weeks under the FMLA, whether it's intermittent or straight through. And of course, that employee would be entitled to continued health insurance and benefits. However, sometimes we're dealing with an employee who's not FMLA eligible or who has exhausted their FMLA time. And it's important for employers and employees alike not to operate solely in FMLA mode. We're so accustomed to hearing the word leave and equating it with FMLA that we don't adequately consider whether or not that employee would also be eligible for ADA leave protections as a reasonable accommodation. Of course, there is the Families First Coronavirus Act, which allows for additional leave. And I believe that information for that is also in the materials, but essentially the act allows for employees who work for employers of less than 500 employees to take up to 80 hours of emergency sick leave. With respect to leave, is there a little feedback when I'm speaking?
Yes, there is.
Okay, Okay, so with respect to leaves due to the illness of relatives, if it's not the employee's own health condition, then of course, now we're only dealing with the FMLA and possible the FFCRA because the ADA wouldn't apply. And concerning leaves with respect to the care of children, the employee would be entitled to FMLA and emergency sick leave under the FFCRA to care for a child whose school or daycare who has closed or where childcare is otherwise unavailable due to the coronavirus. And I just want to make a quick note that, of course, with all of these, you're going to need to evaluate your city and state law protections. And I just want to stop here just to open up the floor for Daryl or John to get their input from a management side perspective, as well as Pam's input from a union side perspective.
Well, just on the federal law that came out, I bring everyone's attention for those who might have paid attention to the statute in the beginning of the summer, but didn't notice that the federal court came down with a decision, particularly with healthcare providers, as to when it could make exemptions from coverage in the statute. You might want to pay close attention to that statute because it really can concern about how you define healthcare providers. It just can't be the guy who's a janitor making the healthcare provider and saying he's no longer covered by the statute. So that's one thing I want to move us forward, though, because we're running behind the clock. I do want to raise one question that was raised by people, and I put it to the table that was put out by people. The question was, what obligation does an employer have to inform employees that an individual has tested positive COVID-19? And I think everyone will agree with me that you cannot tell the other employees who, you can't identify that person's name. It has to be kept quiet. You can tell them someone in your work environment was affected, but you can't go and say Joe Smo had the thing. The question when you say, sorry, go ahead.
And you should be letting it be known that someone has COVID-19, although you should not be identifying them.
And this is a question for you, Pam. What role should the union play?
That's interesting. I mean, we have had issues where employers have not notified the union if there has been someone who's COVID-19 positive. Sometimes employees end up seeing from social media accounts, for example, that someone that they work with appears to have COVID-19, and it's caused real issues. So, I mean, the unions that I work with, they do have ongoing requests for health and safety information. They tend to have strong health and safety language in their contract. Obviously, the union represents the employee who's sick and at home, and is also responsible for representing employees who were working with a previously unidentified person with COVID. And, the union is the representative. The union is entitled to information and to require that steps be taken. Sometimes the union is also in a position of having to defend someone who might not have followed protocols in terms of notifying an employer of their own COVID positive situation. So that's sort of a loose answer, but I feel like, the union wears several hats in this situation. But it is important that employers do share information. I think unions have been very active in making sure that their members have the information that they need to feel safe and to make sure that the employers are adhering to the protocols that are in place.
I basically agree with what you're saying, but from my perspective, I'm not quite sure I would agree that every situation where a person tested positive, you have a duty to notify the union that one of the employees tested positive, particularly if it might not be a union member, particularly might not touch upon people who are members of the union. So I think that's a fact-by-fact scenario analysis. But
You mean if they work on a different floor and have no interaction?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, Yeah.
I wasn't
Or even as a manager who hadn't interacted with the employee, I think you have to notify the employees who were potentially exposed. And to the degree that might be union, I think it's a good idea to let the union know that your members might have been exposed. I would encourage my clients to do that, but I'm not. There's a legal obligation, much more is more ethical and a practical obligation.
Also, the definition of exposure has changed as the
Absolutely.
pandemic has run its course. Now they're saying within 6 feet for 15 minutes. So if you were within, 6 feet for 1 minute, is that considered exposure? Earlier on in the pandemic, you did have situations where, if you were in the same room with someone for even a minute, people feared that exposure would be sufficient to pass the virus.
Let's keep moving because we have to cover a lot more.
Yes, we have 5 minutes, so.
I know. Going to the wage and hour issues real quick, the two things that bring the people's attention, particularly on site with timekeeping. One of my concerns I've been counseling my employees is with the degree we have non-exempt employees and they are working in the work site and they are taking their lunch at their desk on the work site. I'm very concerned about the possibility of employees who are non-exempt being asked to do work while on lunch, or having an employer not realizing or imagine coming over and saying, since you're here, can you do X, Y, and Z? I think you need to make very clear that if the people are not being paid for the lunch period, they need to clock out. I've encouraged employees to create plaques they can put in front of employees saying, please know I'm at lunch now, so people know not to bother them, and send a memo out to all the employees saying, when you're at lunch, stay at lunch. Managers, the people will say they're at lunch, leave them alone, let them be at lunch, because otherwise you might get into a situation when people, Department of Labor might come in and start claiming you did not properly respect this time period. You get stuck with having to pay for that lunch period. On don and duffing, I'm concerned to the degree that if you're requiring people to sanitize their location or wear special equipment, you might be getting a situation where you might need to actually consider that as part of their work day. If they come in and they have to sanitize their work environment, even though they're getting there at 8:45 to sanitize and not really starting at 9 o'clock, but you're saying they've got to do the sanitization before they start the day or after they end the day, that would be a possibility, even though it's classic don and duff of actual work time, which you should keep in mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's Pam.
Okay, so health and safety, since we are running out of time, I'm just, everyone on the call knows about OSHA and the various state plans. And while there's been a lot of frustration from workers that OSHA has really not stepped up and met the moment, there are still the general duty to provide a safe and healthy workplace. There is some COVID related guidance in terms of doing your hazard assessments and in terms of, figuring out risk categories of workers based on the jobs they're doing and in the industries. And, what's going to be most key for your workers feeling comfortable coming back to work is knowing that the employer is not only aware of, but following OSHA guidance, and the same for CDC guidance, and remaining current on that. If their plans are consistent with OSHA guidance and CDC guidance, and that's communicated to the employees, that's going to go a long way. And again, health and safety, that's a mandatory subject to bargaining. A lot of contracts have very strong health and safety language. So, it makes sense to partner with your unions around health and safety because you want your employees to feel comfortable at the workplace, comfortable coming back or staying at work. I think we can move to the next slide.
All right, EO factors. I think this is
I believe.
Melissa and I are quarterbacking this slide. I think we've talked about a lot of it before. Obviously, you're all familiar with the EO issues here. I think I've already told you that I'm laying awake at night worrying about these. I think these are just enormous, and I'll turn it to Melissa, but I would just encourage, if you are an employer, represent employers, slow down. Make sure you have a legitimate business reason that is substantiated before you make any moves. Make sure you're sort of thinking about things like implicit bias. Make sure you're thinking about things like, are you operating too quickly? Slow down and go to legitimate business reason. Melissa?
Yeah, so very quickly, from plaintiff's counsel perspective, we're always evaluating whether the termination, the refusal to accommodate, or other employment decision was for a discriminatory or a legitimate business reason. And with the advent of COVID, we pay particular attention to whether there were any sort of age or disability discrimination, since those are the groups that are disproportionately impacted by COVID. Employer decisions that appear to disproportionately target one group over another will always invite further inquiry. And then finally, just always check your state and city law, which may offer broader or more restrictive protections to employees in a protected class.
So one thing I want to add on, two things I want to add on this thing. One of the things I'm seeing and I've had expressed to my clients is that when it comes to having people go back on site working, unfortunately, it seems to be a disparate impact where a lot of times people of color are being the first to ask to return to work. You need to keep that in mind. It's a possible negative impact, a disparate impact in what you're setting up. So be very careful in doing your analysis when you look at that. And to the degree you think about being gratuitous in your thoughts and say, well, you know, I know the people over 60 might have a higher risk exposure, or the people with heart conditions, you've got to be very careful to the degree that you can't use that as a factor in determining not to return someone to work. It's one thing if they come to you and say they've got a pre-existing condition or something like that, but if you're deciding not to let someone come back to work because you decided because they're older they shouldn't come back to work, you'll be creating a problem for yourself, the EEO violation. Would you guys agree? So
I think we're out of time, so we should probably.
Well, we're gonna wrap it. Just so people know, on next Tuesday, the 29th, we're having a whole seminar at 12:30 to 2 o'clock, another panel discussing the federal and state labor issues regarding duty to bargain, protecting certain activity in a lot more detail. And we thought it'd be a nice little thing for you guys to see this slide here.
Yes, if you don't mind, I'd like to introduce this slide. Everyone, all the panelists unanimously agreed that this really hit the nail on the head. So one of the union clients I work with is 1199, and this really says it all. We agreed. This CNA from the Buffalo area is saying regular communication with management helped us to be prepared and reduce our fear. This is on the union social media site. It's on Instagram, it's on Facebook. There are a lot of comments below, and this is key for all of our panelists. It shows how it reduced employee fear, it addressed the fear factor, and it also helped the employees feel prepared to come to the workplace, to continue to work and do the job.
Before we wrap up, I again want to cite the CLE number. It's SS9551. I want to thank my fellow panelists to be on part of the program. I want to thank all those in the audience participating. Hope you guys found it worthwhile. Stay safe and healthy. Take care, everybody.
And please email any questions.
Definitely.
Thanks again.
Thank
Take
you.
care now.